Ciao a tutti, benvenuti o bentornati sul mio canale. In today's lesson, we're going to look at the periodo ipotetico, Italian conditional sentences. To fully benefit from this video, you will need at least basic knowledge of the Italian subjunctive tenses. You can check out my lessons on Italian subjunctive by clicking on the screen or checking the description box to find the links. Conditional sentences are used to express known facts or hypothetical situations and their potential outcomes. In English, they are also known as if clauses. Here are some examples. In Italian, conditional sentences are known as periodo ipotetico and, like English hypothetical sentences, consist of two parts. An if clause, that is, a subordinate clause introduced by conjunction se, if, stating the condition, and the main clause expressing the consequence or outcome of that condition. Let's take, for example, the sentence, if Davide has a fever, he won't go to school tomorrow. In Italian, the condition, if Davide has a fever, is expressed by the subordinate clause, se Davide ha la febbre, whereas the outcome, he won't go to school tomorrow, is expressed by the main clause, domani non andrà a scuola. Se Davide ha la febbre, domani non andrà a scuola. There are three types of conditional sentences in Italian. Periodo ipotetico della realtà, type 1 conditional sentences. Periodo ipotetico della possibilità, type 2 conditional sentences. Periodo ipotetico dell'irrealtà, type 3 conditional sentences. Periodo ipotetico della realtà. Italian type 1 conditional sentences are used when the condition is true or possible and the consequence is certain or probable. These types of sentences are constructed in different ways. We can use se plus the present indicative, indicativo presente, to state the condition, and the present indicative, presente indicativo again, to express the consequence. For example, se ho tempo, esco a fare una passeggiata. If I have time, I go out for a walk. We can also use se plus present indicative, indicativo presente, for the condition, and the future indicative, indicativo futuro, for the consequence. For example, se ho tempo, uscirò a fare una passeggiata. If I have time, I'll go out for a walk. We can use se plus future indicative, indicativo futuro, to express the condition, and again the future indicative, indicativo futuro, for the outcome. For example, se avrò tempo, uscirò a fare una passeggiata. If I have time, I'll go out for a walk. And we can use se plus present indicative, indicativo presente, in the conditional clause, and the imperative, imperativo, in the main clause. For example, se hai tempo, esci a fare una passeggiata. If you have time, go out for a walk. Let's look at more examples of periodo ipotetico della realtà. Se studiano, passano l'esame. Se piangi troppo, avrai gli occhi gonfi e arrossati. Se farete un po' di sport, la vostra salute migliorerà. Se sei libero all'ora di pranzo, vieni a mangiare con me. Periodo ipotetico della possibilità. Italian type 2 conditional sentences are used when the condition is possible, but the consequence can be likely or unlikely. It might or might not happen. With this sentence type, we use se plus imperfect subjunctive congiuntivo imperfetto for the condition and the present conditional condizionale presente to express the consequence. Take, for example, the sentence se vivessi in campagna pianterei tanti alberi da frutto. If I lived in the countryside, I would plant loads of fruit trees. This sentence expresses a likely consequence. Even if I'm not living in the countryside right now, there is a possibility that one day I will, and that I will also be able to plant loads of fruit trees. As I mentioned earlier, type 2 conditional sentences are used to express possible or likely consequences. However, this sentence structure can sometimes be used to express impossible conditions and unrealistic consequences. Let's take the sentence se potessi tornare indietro rifarei le stesse scelte. If I could go back in time, I would make the same choices. In this case, the consequence is unrealistic because it is impossible for me to go back in time and make the same choices I made in the past. Let's look at more examples of type 2 conditional sentences and of sentences that look like type 2 conditional sentences but that actually express impossibility and unrealistic consequences. Se fossi meno timido, farei nuove amicizie più facilmente. Se avessi più tempo libero, leggerei un libro alla settimana. Se non avessi perso il treno, sarei già arrivata a casa. Se fosse estate tutto l'anno, sarei felice. Periodo ipotetico dell'irrealtà. Italian type 3 conditional sentences are used when the condition refers to something impossible or unlikely and the consequence is also impossible and unlikely. These types of conditional sentences can either express an impossible consequence in the past or an impossible consequence in the present. In the first case, sentences are formed with se plus past perfect subjunctive congiuntivo trapassato in the subordinate clause and the past conditional condizionale passato in the main clause. So, for example, by saying se fossi stato più attento avrei fatto meno errori, if I had been more careful I would have made fewer mistakes, we are describing a past action that didn't happen and that made the desired outcome impossible to achieve. Type 3 conditional sentences expressing an impossible consequence in the present are formed with se plus past perfect subjunctive congiuntivo trapassato in the subordinate clause and the present conditional condizionale presente in the main clause. Let's take, for example, the sentence se non avessi bevuto un caffè, adesso sarei meno nervosa. If I hadn't had a coffee, I would be less nervous now. In this case, a past action has still got repercussions in the present. The action of having a coffee makes it impossible for my current state to change. I cannot go back in time and undo the fact that by drinking a coffee I now feel nervous. Let's look at other examples of type 3 conditional sentences impossible in the past and impossible in the present. Se avessi saputo che oggi c'era un concerto, avrei comprato i biglietti. Se fossero andati a piedi, non sarebbero rimasti bloccati nel traffico. Se non mi fossi rotto una gamba, adesso potrei andare a sciare. Se avessi superato l'esame di guida, adesso potresti andare al lavoro in macchina. Other types of Italian conditional sentences. Alongside the basic Italian conditional sentence structures we have just seen, other structures might be used to express conditions or hypotheses. Two in particular are worth mentioning: conditional sentences using the imperfect indicative and conditional sentences using the gerund. Let's look at each of them in detail. Conditional sentences with the imperfect indicative. There are three things you should remember about this type of sentences. First, the imperfetto indicativo is used only in conditional sentences expressing impossible outcomes or consequences. In other words, it is used in the periodo ipotetico dell'irrealtà. Second, in these conditional sentences, the imperfetto indicativo is used in both the subordinate clause introduced by se and in the main clause. Third, conditional sentences with the imperfetto indicativo are only used in spoken Italian. In written Italian, you must follow the rules of periodo ipotetico that we have seen earlier. Let me also add that, although the use of the imperfetto indicativo in type 3 conditional sentences is acceptable in everyday conversation, learning and using the grammatically correct conditional sentence structures is always preferable. Let's look at some examples of these alternative type 3 conditional sentences. Let's take the sentence, "If you had asked me, I would have helped you." The regular Italian type 3 conditional sentence equivalent is "Se me lo avessi chiesto, ti avrei aiutato." Here we have the congiuntivo trapassato, past perfect subjunctive, in the subordinate clause, and the condizionale passato, past conditional, in the main clause. But if we are engaged in informal conversation, we can use the type 3 conditional sentence "Se me lo chiedevi, ti aiutavo," where the imperfetto indicativo, imperfect indicative, is used in both the subordinate and the main clause. Let's take another sentence. If she had been lucky, she would have won the lottery. Again, the Italian regular type 3 structure would be "Se fosse stata fortunata, avrebbe vinto la lotteria," whereas the informal conversational structure using the imperfetto is "Se era fortunata, vinceva la lotteria." Conditional sentences with the gerund. When the subordinate clause and the main clause of an Italian conditional sentence share the same subject, you can, in some cases, use the gerundio in the subordinate clause. For example, to translate the sentence "If they want, they can go back home now," in Italian we can use the type 1 conditional sentence structure and say "Se vogliono, ora possono tornare a casa," where the present indicative is used to express both the condition and the consequence. But because the subordinate and the main clause have the same subject, we can also express the condition using the gerund and say "Volendo, ora possono tornare a casa." In this case, both sentences are perfectly fine. Let's take another sentence. "You wouldn't solve anything even if you cried." We can translate this sentence using type 2 conditional sentence structure and say "Anche se piangessi, non risolveresti nulla." But because here too we've got the same subject in the main clause and the subordinate clause, then we can use the gerund to express the condition and say "Anche piangendo, non risolveresti nulla." Again, both sentences are correct. One more example. "If I had left early, I wouldn't have missed the lecture." In Italian, we can use the type 3 conditional sentence structure and say "Se fossi partito prima, non avrei perso la lezione." But again, because the English sentence has got the same subject in both the main clause and the subordinate clause, we can translate it into Italian by using the gerund to express the condition and say "Partendo prima, non avrei perso la lezione." And once again, both sentences are fine to use. Esercizi. Now translate these conditional sentences into Italian. You can pause the video to do this exercise and then resume it to check the answers. Soluzioni. And that's all for this lesson. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Grazie e arrivederci.